Hello, in the fourth stage of the professional epoxy training program, we will provide detailed information on how to sand epoxy. One of the most important and highly anticipated contents of our training videos is the sanding training, which includes the most important technical details that need to be done correctly for epoxy to achieve the best gloss and transparency. Although there may seem to be details that some users think they know in this training video, we recommend following the information in the video without skipping. The section you will be missing may contain critical information for achieving the maximum transparency and gloss that you have not been able to reach. The vast majority of those using epoxy for commercial or hobby purposes make significant mistakes during the sanding stage and fail to achieve the desired high gloss and transparency. The biggest reason for this mistake is that the purpose and principle of sanding are not fully understood, and most manufacturers do sanding based on guesswork and estimation. First, let's address why epoxy products are sanded. The reason for sanding the cured materials is to ensure that the surface becomes smooth and perfectly flat. Additionally, another reason for sanding is that after the epoxy casting is completed, the epoxy does not have the highest gloss due to its structure, resulting in a duller appearance. The surface of the cured epoxy casting sometimes has visible, and sometimes invisible, bumps and holes. For this reason, the sanding stage is a process used to make the entire surface smooth before polishing operations. However, if this surface smoothing step, which proceeds with thick to fine sandpaper, is not done correctly, it will leave micro sandpaper scratches that are difficult or impossible to remove at the end of the sanding process. This situation causes the material to gain a standard gloss when you reach the polishing stage, but it does not achieve maximum transparency and shine. You can see unique glass transparency in the products of a few workshops around the world. Manufacturers trying to achieve this level of transparency and gloss are experimenting with different materials and techniques to obtain perfect glass transparency, but they are not successful. The reason your epoxy product does not achieve the desired maximum transparency, no matter what you do, is the micro sanding scratches that you cannot see at first glance. So how can we see the micro scratches? The biggest mistake manufacturers make is not removing micro scratches that occur as a result of sanding during the polishing phase. Do you think the product is shiny enough even though you cannot see the micro scratches? The reason for this is that these micro scratches may only be visible when viewed from the right angle in light reflections or in areas. Now let's talk a little more about the sanding process. First of all, we need to know that the machine we need is a circular vibrating sander. This machine is also referred to as an eccentric sander in some brands. If you are a less experienced user, it is important to use only this machine for better results. For more experienced users, the second machine, which will be used in only one stage and whose details we will explain shortly, is the hand grinding. The hand grinding machine should only be used at the beginning with 40 grit to quickly smooth the surface and make it even. One of the mistakes in the sanding process is to proceed the sanding stage several times with machines with different names, such as hand grinding. Due to the balanced structure of these machines in application, they are not the right choice for leveling the surface to even levels. Due to high speeds, base, and machine structures, it is impossible to ensure equal application on all surfaces. We recommend the sanding process with hand grinding only for the initial stage at 40 grit for rough surface leveling for less experienced manufacturers. Users who do not have the necessary experience in using the hand grinding machine must perform this first step with an eccentric sander. Although this process may slightly extend the time of the initial sanding process, it will ensure that you achieve the most accurate result in terms of production quality. After this stage, you need to make all sandpapers from 60 grit to 2000 grit containing the following numbers: 60801201501802203320060080012001500200. If some users cannot reach exactly these numbers, they can obtain close numbers. For example, 240 or 280 instead of 220. However, if you ensure the use of 280, this does not mean that you will skip 320 grit sandpaper. The application recipe we will provide you is sufficient to be applied exactly as it is. It will ensure that you reach the desired maximum result. You do not need to reduce or increase this order. Which sanding brand should be used is one of the most frequently asked questions. When you apply the correct techniques, the sanding brand will not significantly change the result. You can comfortably use the products of many sanding brands, except for very low-quality sandpapers. The sanding brand we prefer in our products is featured in a special section for subscribers only on our Instagram page. The speed of the eccentric sander's movement over the surface is very important. Watch the video carefully, as very aggressive movements can deform the surface, while very fast movements will also reduce the performance of the sander on the surface. You can operate the machine in such a way that each sandpaper is applied evenly across the entire surface. Our recommendation is that whichever number of passes you make from top to bottom, you should also perform them from right to left or left to right evenly and in sequence. For example, if you make one pass from top to bottom, the next pass should immediately be from right to left. In addition, after running the sander from one side to the other, make sure that the lateral shift ratio is about 50% of the machine base. In addition to these processes, you need to constantly check your sandpaper and clean it if there is any dust stuck to its surface. Dust stuck on the surface of the sandpaper will prevent the sanding from being completed properly. The most important stage of sanding training is to know exactly at which stage the sanding is completed and when you need to move on to the next. Over the years, we have witnessed many formulas used for sanding by both professional and amateur epoxy users. Some of these are techniques based on guesswork that cannot provide many precise solutions, such as sanding for a certain number of passes, sanding for a certain duration, visually checking the surface, and manually checking the surface. So how can we understand that the sanding we have done is completely finished and that we need to move on to the next? The supporting product we will use for this may surprise you a bit. The product, a marker pen used mostly for writing on white. Let's provide detailed guidance on how to use a wood pencil on the sander and what we need to pay attention to. Before starting to sand, we randomly draw lines on the epoxy surfaces with the marker pen. However, you should perform this process on most of the surface. Because this process will be a very good reference for the situation we are about to explain. If we could look very closely at the surface before starting to sand, we could see it as a surface filled with curves. Now think of the line above as 40 grit sandpaper and the sand particles on it. During the sanding process, the surface is opened, and these curves are partially eliminated. However, for example, after the 40 grit sanding process is completed, if we look from a closer shot, we can see that the surface has hundreds of tiny pits left by the sand particles of the 40 grit sandpaper. When the sanding is completed, let's say we move on to the 60 grit sanding stage, which has smaller sand particles, wear down the deep pits left by the 40 grit sandpaper, reducing the micro scratches on the surface. This is exactly the point where, if the sandpaper you used did not completely remove the scratches from the previous sanding and you have already moved on to a finer grit, there will remain micro scratches on the surface that are difficult to eliminate. Because as the sandpaper particles get smaller, it becomes more difficult to remove deep micro grooves. And this situation is the biggest obstacle to achieving the maximum transparency and shine we are trying to obtain. However, it is not possible for us to see this situation with the naked eye. At this point, the lines we draw on the surface with the pencil come to our aid. The ink of the pencil penetrates into the micro cavities left by the sandpaper on the surface, allowing us to understand whether the micro cavities created by the previous sanding have been removed or not. And in this case, what needs to be done is to continue sanding until the pencil lines on the surface are completely gone, regardless of which grit sandpaper you are using. One of the mistakes made in this process is as follows. For example, a part of the pencil lines on the surface has disappeared, but the lines are still visible in some areas of the product surface. In this case, definitely do not sand only the area where the pencil marks remain locally. Because this situation shows you that your surface is not that even, and the areas where the pencil lines remain are partially at lower levels. When you sand only that area more, you will have deepened the surface level that is already lower. To get the best result, continue to sand the entire surface evenly until the pencil lines remaining on the surface disappear. This process should be applied to all sandpapers in practice. Now you know how to sand flawlessly and completely. You can ask any questions you have in the comments section. To not miss new training programs, you can subscribe to our YouTube page and check out our Audiwood subscribers only Instagram page for videos that contain special information.